Okay, well, let's get going. If you have practice problems, bring them up, 7 or 8. Now I keep getting questions and I completely understand what's going on with the practice problems. When's the next chapter due? So if we go by the syllabus and the schedule I came up with, chapter 8 would have been due today. But we're running behind. No big deal. It doesn't really matter for my schedule. But because we're running behind, just assume the practice problems are due in person the week after they're assigned on Moodle. So week 8's this week. So bring it in no later than Tuesday. And then week 9 is next week, but the week after for turn it in. Now, the other thing I keep getting is that you guys all have different editions of the book. And that's fine, but just make sure when you are studying for your test that you look at my practice problem solutions here, because these are the problems that will be most like the ones on the midterm. So if you have a different edition of the book and you're not quite sure if you're answering the right questions, these are the ones that are the right questions. So be sure to look at these. I'll make chapter 7 available right now. Okay, and then next week I'll make chapter 8 available. Okay. All right. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I come across one of the questions access the discovering data exercise to complete the question, and am I supposed to be able to be accessing that? Because I'm trying to look it up. I tried to make an account and I don't know where to.
No, just do your best to Google it. And I'm sorry about that. I actually, if I seem a little flustered, I actually just got into an argument with the bookstore manager about this exact, very similar thing about not having access to the digital. That the school wants us to buy at the bookstore our books, but everything's moved online and they don't want us to point you to the publisher. Anyways, the whole thing. The point is, if you have something like that, just try to Google it. And if you can't Google it, don't.
I just go to the next one if I can't find any information.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so who's expecting to do a presentation? You are, and you are. What's your name?
Aiden?
Didn't you go already?
Yeah, I had like 2 separate things.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot more sense. And what was your name again?
Riley.
Riley. Okay. So after the break, we'll have Aiden go and then Riley, and then we'll do our quiz. Okay. So let's finish talking about unemployment, and then let's talk about inflation. Okay, so we started talking about unemployment on Tuesday. Just a quick review. Unemployment is closely related to the business cycle, right? As we can see the cycle on this graph, the purple is the recession, the white is growth areas. So you can see unemployment goes down in growth times and goes up in recession. So they're highly correlated. We also learned about the unemployment rate, which is a macroeconomic indicator that tells us the percentage of people unemployed. But that percentage is not of the total population. It's a percentage of the labor force. The labor force is all workers, unemployed and employed. So all people that want to work. You're only unemployed if you're not working and you want to work. We can look at the indicator of the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate is going to be our labor force, the people wanting to work, divided by the total people in the country. All right. Our labor force in this country runs around 50%, goes up and down. But around half of the people in this country are wanting to and available to work. Then we can figure out our unemployment number by taking the number of unemployed workers and dividing that by our labor force. So if unemployment is 5%, that means 5% of the 50% of people that want to work don't have jobs. Okay, unemployment as a metric has some downsides. It can overstate the actual rate of unemployment, and it can also understate. So we took a look at some special cases that were in understates, and one of them is discouraged workers. So if you can't get a job and you're just mad and frustrated, you give up, and why even try? You're discouraged and you're no longer in the labor force. Marginally attached. This is you're kind of on the edge of the labor force. This is you take a job or you're not. I'm a stay-at-home parent. If something comes along, I'll take it or not. That's marginally attached. So you're not in the labor force. And then underemployed. I want a job, I want a full-time job. I go and find a part-time job. That's underemployed. The true picture of unemployment is always higher than the official unemployment number, which is here in orange. When you factor in marginally attached and discouraged and underemployed, the true unemployment number can be much higher. In this particular case, in 2010, where we had almost 20% of total unemployment, including marginally attached and discouraged and part-time. Again, this is nearly 20% of people that want to work, which is only about half of the population. So if we take 350 million people in the US, there's only a labor participation rate of say 50%, that's 175 million. And then almost 20% or whatever this is, 17% of them are unemployed. So we subtract that, that leaves us at about 130, 140 million people out of a country of 150 million that had jobs. That are pushing the GDP numbers. We also, the unemployment number also does not represent subgroups. So subgroups of our population might have disproportionately large unemployment. Okay. That correlation we talked about between unemployment and employment, it's pretty consistent, but not always. And one of the ways that's not consistent is sometimes during a boom cycle, the unemployment number does not decrease like we expect. We call that a jobless recovery. Okay. And again, what more subgroups is that some subgroups are more affected than others at certain times. So coming out of a recession, students, recent grads are more affected than people with experience for unemployment. And then you can break that down that women coming out of recessions as a recent grad typically find jobs faster than men. Okay, so then we can also talk about the types of unemployment. All right, so unemployment is natural and we want it and it's good. Without unemployment, we have inability to move between jobs very easily. And there's three types of unemployment. So we talk about frictional. So frictional is when everything's working as it should. The systems in place work as they should, but it just takes time to get a new job. It's a lack of information problem. I don't know who's going to hire me, so it takes me a few months to find the company that's going to hire me. And if I'm a company, it takes me a few months to find the right worker, right? That's frictional. Then there's structural. Structural is there's a problem, and the problem is within the systems in place. So the structural is that all the coal mines in the area are going out of business, and everyone that was trained to be a coal miner no longer has a coal mining job, but they don't have the skills to be a computer programmer. That's a structural problem. Other common structural problems are labor unions, which cause an artificial structural problem. Efficiency wages, all right? So efficiency wages, minimum wage is a type of efficiency wage. It's a government enforced efficiency wage. So minimum wage says you can't pay more, you can't pay a worker less than $15 an hour. The problem with that is that in our labor market, the equilibrium point might be $10 an hour. So there are workers out there that are willing to work for $10 an hour. And an efficiency wage, like the minimum wage, means that we have to pay more than that to get what we want. Now, the efficiency wage is government forced, and efficiency wage is chosen by the employer to get a high caliber worker. But either way, it causes gap. Now, remember, when we look at this, we typically think of, when we look at supply and demand, we typically think of supply and demand is that the supplier is the company, the business, and the demand's the consumer, the buyer. Here it's switched, because the supplier are the workers supplying labor, and the demand is from the companies demanding that labor. So if we look at minimum wage, maybe the equilibrium wage is $7 an hour, but minimum wage is 11. If that's the case, then there's lots of people willing to work at that higher wage, but companies demand much less. The book calls out minimum wage in particular because it's there's evidence in the US anyway that minimum wage actually, unlike an efficiency wage, minimum wage will actually boost economic output, or at least not hurt it. And this is kind of a hard concept to understand. I get this argument, this discussion with people that own small businesses, like in Portland or Seattle, and they get mad because, oh, well, Seattle or Portland's going to increase minimum wage. I can't afford to pay my workers more. What they're missing, why minimum wage works, is that if I'm running like a small business, like a McDonald's or something, and I have to pay my workers more, and everyone around me has to pay their workers more, the extra $1 or $2 an hour for that level of worker is going to go, they're going to go use that, not going to put it in their mattress, they're not going to put it in the bank account, they're going to spend it. And that increases economic output in the area. So the business ends up getting more income, even though they have to pay their workers more. Okay, so now that we understand frictional and structural, we can get to the concept of natural. Natural unemployment is frictional and structural put together. So this is the two concepts of frictional being, it just takes time to get a new job. There's nothing we can do about that. And structural meaning there's a mismatch of what's available in the labor market and what's desired. And there's right. You add those together, that's just natural. This is the outcome of how systems work. So all things being equal, you always have natural employment that is made up of having some people that just takes time to find a new job and some people that are mistrained or mismatched for the job market. But that's not actual unemployment. Actual unemployment, you have to add in cyclical. So what's cyclical? Trying to find the right graph here. Cyclical. Cyclical is the cycles of the business cycle. So the business cycle, there's boom times and the recession times. Boom times, recession times, and that impacts unemployment. So if you take out the boom and bust cycle of the economy, and this was just a flat line, you know, there's no change in the economy, you would still have natural unemployment. It would still take time to get a job, whether there's lots of jobs or little jobs, it still takes time. So they're still frictional. And there's still gonna be a mismatch of skills, so they're still structural. But then you add in the boom and bust cycle, then you have this external third force we have to account for. So over the past year, the cyclical nature of the recession made lots of jobs, people get laid off. So there was more people laid off causing higher unemployment than there would have been otherwise with natural unemployment. So when GDP falls, firms lay off workers. Idle labor and capital means economic growth not being maximized, means the ability of the economy to create more jobs goes down. So that's cyclical. Cyclical is the business cycle. So what changes the natural rate? Regardless of what's happening in the business cycle, what changes the natural rate of unemployment? Well, that's changing demographics, baby boomers, people retiring, changing of the amount of migrants, changing of education rates in society. Those changes the labor force. And there's also changes in the market institutions, like unions, temp agencies, new technology, and government policies like promoting job training programs or tax credits for hiring a certain type of worker. So here's a changing demographic. So from 1948 to 2017, we have two metrics here. So we have women entering the labor force in the purple. So this is a changing demographic. So suddenly you go from less than 30% participation for women up to 50%. That's quite a bit of people entering the labor force, changes the demographics of the labor force. Then you have the baby boomers. So from 1945 to 1955, 1960, the baby boom was happening. And these people came out of working age in the mid 60s, in the 70s. So you see this huge increase of labor participation below the age of 25. And now if you take this out, you'll see a major decrease because all those baby boomers are retiring, something like 10,000 a day. Okay, so this is kind of a weird concept, but it's important to understand. So inflation, I'm sorry, I'm already jumping to the next thing. So yeah, so we're going to get into inflation now. So that's this is unemployment. So we're done with unemployment. Any questions on unemployment? No. Okay. If you guys have any questions, you can ask in the middle of the lecture too. It's fine. Okay, so now let's jump over to inflation. So they're related, and unemployment and inflation are related, and that's why they're in the same chapter. Inflation happens, it's a term that's often misunderstood. It can hurt the economy, but not in the way that most people think. And we're going to explain why. But this graph is kind of nice because we are talking about price levels, price index. That's what this green line is. So this is showing price levels over this time period, 1960 to 2017, going from 25 up to 250. So everything's getting more expensive. Price levels going up, but it's a nice steady slope. A nice steady slope overall. You'll notice the slope is really steady, linear right here. And then you look at the inflation rate down here. So the inflation rate is the rate of change in price level. So this is price increase, and this is the rate of change. So as you can see, when this rate of change is staying steady up and down around 2%, maybe up to 4%, you have a nice linear slope. Now look in the 80s, 70s and 80s. You went from inflation at 2%. Suddenly, within a year or two, it's at 12%, and then back down to 4%, and then up to 14%, and then way back down to 2%. That's a lot of change in a short time. And you can see that on the price index, how much more steep the slope is. So that's what's bad. Inflation is not bad. Increasing in pricing is not bad, but when that change is happening quicker than everything else. Imagine if you're buying a loaf of bread in 1975, price is $1, and then you go in a month later and the price is $1.50. And then a couple of months later, you go back in and it's back down to $1.10. And then you go in the next year and it's $2. This is huge changes in your expenses, but do you think your salary kept up with it that quickly? Does your employer raise your salary 10% 1 month and lower it down to keep them rate with inflation? No, you might get a raise once a year. You might get a raise every couple of years. So inflation is partly bad because it gets out of sync with the rest of the economy. So that rate of change is very important. So what's the better measure? Real wages, real income. So we take the wage rate and we divide it by the price level, or your income divided by the price level. All right. So this is an important concept. Really see, make sure you understand it. Inflation's not bad. Let me rephrase that. Things getting more expensive is not bad. Inflation can be bad if that rate of change is faster than the economy can grow with it. Inflation doesn't make everyone poorer. What makes everyone poorer is when price levels are out of sync with wage levels, right? When costs are out of sync with price levels. So here's how you actually do the inflation rate. So you take the price in year one, or you assume in year two, you subtract the price in year one and divide by 1. So we're talking about price level. We already talked last month or last week about a little bit how to determine price level. So the example being, if our CPI is 120 in year one, 135 in year two, you subtract it, divide it times 100 to get the percentage. And then we see inflation is 12.5% in this example. So it's 12.5% bad in this example. But everyone's been freaking out this past month because inflation was 7% last year. If you look on this chart, inflation was 16%, 15% in 1980. But the last 10 years, it's been at or below 2%. Doesn't seem too bad. Yeah.
So is price level the same thing as CPI?
Yeah. The CPI is a price index, so same thing. Yeah. So when we say price inflation is 7%, is it bad? Probably not, especially since our inflation has been artificially low for a decade. It's probably just catching up to make this trend line, price level line, consistent. Is it bad? It can be bad though, because if your wages haven't increased 7% this year, then your prices did. So you lost real wage. In the US, we target, we'll talk a lot more about this, we target 2% inflation. So that's why we've been doing that for a while.
I'm sorry, I missed this one late.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so we've been targeting 2%. So that's we do our economic policies in order to target 2% now. Yeah.
So on one of the previous slides, it said that incomes usually rise with inflation, so long as you're not outpacing the growth of the economy.
Yeah.
Why is that? Incomes usually rise.
Well, it's a good question. Some would argue that labor unions caused this, which is a good thing, why we have labor unions. But yeah, it's because of supply and demand in the labor market. So that equilibrium point starts to change. So when you have inflation, it will shift the supply curve over so that you have a new equilibrium point at a higher equilibrium price. right? Does that make sense? So if inflation goes up, I'm going to demand that my employer gives me a raise that price, or I'm going to leave and go to another job, and then I'm going to go to the job that pays me the higher price. So over time, the supply of labor demands a higher wage. So that's-
Competition in unions.
So the real reason why this happens is unions, especially, unions are less important part of society. But 100 years ago, that's what caused a lot of the laws to protect labor now. Unions are one of the reasons that's why people unionize. People that are smart just know this. To give you an example, at my work, Kaiser Permanente, we have hundreds of thousands of employees. We also have several unions, and the unions, one union went on strike this past year demanding a wage increase at the rate of inflation or higher. And they ended up getting it. So then the rest of us that aren't in unions, do we just sit around and say, well, you guys give them more money and we'll take the less rate? No. Well, so we didn't unionize, but the Kaiser has to give everyone a big increase too. But yeah, it's all about the equilibrium point. There's no law saying that you have to raise wages. Okay. So let's talk about some of the costs, some of the bad side of inflation. Well, one cost is the shoe leather cost, and this literally comes from wearing down shoe leather or shoes. The book gives the example of Germany in the 1920s where they experienced hyperinflation, and store owners or people would get money in the morning selling their goods or whatever, and the value of that money was decreasing so fast that they would go to the bank to exchange it into another country's currency or to gold or something. And then in the afternoon, they would go back, right? That's how fast money was changing, is literally they have to go to the bank 2 or 3 times a day before the value of that currency went down. So that actual cost of the shoes wearing down from the extra activity, it's called the shoe leather cost. The less funny side of that is that banks had to hire more tellers, right? So kind of good, more jobs, but also kind of bad because we want those workers working and they could be doing something more productive than exchanging currencies from different countries all day. So that's a drag on GDP. All right, so shoe leather cost is the funny name to say money's losing value so quickly that people waste more time running around trying to protect themselves from that deflation. Or excuse me, inflation. And he gives the real example on economics in action, which I don't know if anybody signed up for. Israel, it's happening in Israel in the 80s. People spending hours in line at the bank because they want to exchange their cash for some other currency or some other thing of value. If they're sitting in line in a bank, then they're not working. They're not adding value to the economy. All right, the second cost is the menu cost. So if you own a restaurant, you have to print up your menus, which describe what you sell and have the price. It costs money. If the price goes up after a few months, if money loses value a few months, you have to change your prices to go up. You have to print more menus. It's a physical, literal cost to printing menus. Right? It's not just restaurants. Go to the grocery store. Grocery stores have thousands of little price tags. Right? So if inflation is going up and you have to raise your prices every couple of months or every few weeks or every day, you have to hire a bunch more people to go around and do that. Those people could be better off used and it's something else more productive for the economy. Okay, and the third is the unit of account cost. So this one is, we're going to actually talk about money more, but I'm just curious what now if anybody can tell me, like, what is money? Like philosophically, like what's money? Anybody have an idea? Yeah.
It's like a reward.
Yeah, could be used as a reward.
Yeah. things and
Yeah.
producing things, and
So why is it the reward though? Why do you want it?
so you can buy other things.
Perfect. Yeah.
Kind of like an item that we agree a value upon, and then we use that for currency.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually your two concepts together is the right answer. So we agree that this thing has value, and because we agree it has value, you want it as a reward because you can turn it around and buy something else. So there's a lot of kind of like mental math. We agree this paper, which is worthless otherwise, has value because we agree that it'll have the same value to somebody else. So what happens when this thing that has no objective value starts losing that? You can't, with hyperinflation, it loses that value so quick you can't even do the math in your mind anymore. I can't do that. Oh, I got $10. Oh, that can buy me lunch. That can buy me a quart tank of gas, whatever. Now you don't know what it can buy. So it loses its value as a unit of account. Like this example from Zimbabwe, this $100 trillion. The height of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, you could just find these lying on the ground. $100 trillion, right? Because the value of the currency, the value of its unit of account has diminished so quick, you don't know what it's worth, and it loses its value. Okay. So while inflation can be good and can be bad, right? Mostly good if it's under control. Even with that, there are winners and losers when there's inflation. So the most common example of this is if you borrow money. If I borrow $1,000 in today's money, right? It's worth $1,000 today as money, but because of inflation, it'll only be worth, if inflation is 5%, it'll be worth 5% less next year, and 5% less the year after. So that $1,000 is worth 950. What's 5% of 1,000? 950. And then like 945 the year after, or 905. Okay, whatever. It loses value every year. So you could, if you know the inflation rate, you could build that into your borrowing. So if I borrow $1,000 and I have to pay it back, then the payment back period is not as hard, or the payment back amount is kind of hard to change. But what's easy to change if you're figuring this out is the interest rate. So if the interest rate is 10%, that you have to, I'm paying back on this loan, and I'm expecting inflation of 5%. That means I'm actually only, if I'm the bank, I'm only going to make a profit of 5%. I'll get 10% in nominal terms, but the value of that money was worth 5% less. So the nominal interest rate is the rate you see in the loan paperwork, 3%, 5%. But the real interest rate is that minus the inflation. Yeah.
Can we possibly go over the practice question 6? I think it's C, but I just want to like
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary expects the inflation rate to be 5% and she'll be willing to pay an interest rate of 3%. Joe expects the inflation rate to be 5%. He's willing to lend money if he receives a real interest rate of 3. If the actual inflation rate is 6, and the loan contract specifies a nominal rate of 8. Okay, and then you think that it's C. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So let's take it step by step. So Mary expects an inflation rate of 5%, and she's willing to take a real interest rate of 3%. Then what's the nominal interest rate? All right, nominal is the interest, is the interest on the paper. Right? So the interest on the paper would be the real plus the inflation rate. So the nominal in this case is 8% that she's expecting. And Joe is willing to, if he receives real rate of, he expects a 5% too, and a real, okay. So they're on the same page here. They're both expecting 5% and a real of 3. But the actual inflation rate is 6%. So 1% higher. So money lost value at 1% more. So who wins when money loses value? The borrower does. So in this case, Mary is paying back dollars that are worth less. Yeah, it is C. So when interest rate is higher than what's expected, the borrower always wins and the lender loses. And maybe a better example would be this. I borrowed lots of money in 2020 to buy a car, and I got a 3% interest rate. So the bank, when they lent that to me, this was before the recession, they're expecting inflation of 2%, right? So they were charging me 3%. They're expecting inflation at 2%. That means the real interest rate is 1%. They're expected to make a 1% profit. But this was before 2021. And what did the interest rate or inflation rate end up being in 2021? 7%. So you take my interest rate of 3 and you subtract inflation of 7, you get -4. So I'm paying -4%. Right? So they're losing, they're no longer making 1%. The bank is losing 4% profit on my loan. Right? So think of it in that terms. The borrower makes money because they're paying back with dollars that are worth less. So this the other example is this in the 80s, before the large inflation rate, the early 80s, people took out loans for mortgages. So if you took out a mortgage here in 1974 or so, right, inflation was at 2%. And then by the next year, it's at 12%. So if your mortgage rate was, 10%, and inflation went up 10% that year, essentially you're paying 0 interest on your mortgage. So it was a good time to buy here. But vice versa, if you bought here and you're expecting the interest or inflation to stay at 14% and it drops down to 2%, the borrower gets hurt and the lender makes money. Now you have to pay back dollars that are worth what you have to pay back dollars that are worth more than you expect. And so the math holds here. If I borrowed at 10% and I was expecting 2%, but instead it dropped, now I'm paying the equivalent of 20% interest rate, real interest rate. Okay, and I think this is the last slide, but let's take it in for a second. So when we talk about inflation, we talk about kind of like a negative or unavoidable outcome of the things we want. We want growth, we want jobs, and the negative outcome of that is inflation. So what happens when we want less inflation? Well, then we have to also do the reverse. And we have to slow the economy down and have less jobs. So that's what this is showing. This is showing in 1980, or let's start with the blue line, 74. Unemployment was 5.5%, but inflation was 10%. And that's high. It's high because it gets out of whack with the rest of the economy. So we're trying to avoid that. Right? So we have to start bringing it down. Well, you bring it down by hitting the brakes on the economy. So they hit the brakes and unemployment skyrocketed. And for the longest time, inflation didn't even decrease, but finally it did. And it goes down and then unemployment goes down. Very similar in 80. Right? So we like to keep inflation at 2%, not because 10% is bad, but as that rate goes up, it gets out of whack with wages and other things. And the bigger reason is when it gets out of whack, it hurts to bring it back in line. Because the way we bring it back in line is by hurting ourselves. We have to hurt our own productivity. We have to make people go out of jobs. That brings it down. So the better thing is try to keep it at 2%. And when it starts getting out of whack, rein it in before it turns into a bigger problem. Okay, I think that's what I have for inflation. Any questions? All right, let's take a break. 20 after.